My son used to call me every Sunday. Then he found a town that had been erased from history. Not abandoned, erased. Removed from maps, records, almost from memory itself. He started rebuilding its census, name by name, family by family. Then strangers across the country began writing to say he was right, about people he should never have known. And the more of that town he brought back, the more of himself he seemed to lose. Now there are only 5 names left, and he says they're waiting. My son was never obsessive. I want to start there because everything I'm about to describe will make it sound like he was, and I need you to understand that the person this happened to was not someone who had been building toward it his whole life. Nathan was steady. That was the word people used. His teachers used it. His first girlfriend used it, guys, I think, as a complaint. His boss at the data management company in Grand Rapids used it in every annual review I wasn't supposed to see, but that Nathan left open on his laptop when I visited. Steady, reliable, consistent output, even-keeled. He called me every Sunday. Not because I asked him to, because he'd done it since he moved out at 22, and by 31 he'd done it 470 times. Give or take the Sundays he was sick or I was traveling. He called at the same time. We talked for the same approximate duration. He asked about my week. I asked about his. Neither of us said anything that would be remembered by Wednesday. I loved those calls the way you love weather that doesn't require a jacket. You don't think about it. You just live inside it. He stopped calling in March of last year. Not all at once. The first missed Sunday, I assumed he was busy. The second, I sent a text. Everything okay? And he replied, yeah, sorry, deep into something. Call you tomorrow. He didn't call tomorrow. The third Sunday, I called him, and he picked up, and we talked for 4 minutes, and his voice was the same, but the rhythm was different. He was distracted, not rude. Distracted the way someone is when they're carrying on a conversation while reading something they can't put down. I could hear his keyboard in the background. Not typing, scrolling. The continuous soft rattle of a person moving through a long document. I asked him what he was working on. He said, a project. I asked what kind. He said, historical stuff. I'll tell you about it when it's further along. And then he asked about my week, and the question sounded automated, and we hung up. And I sat in my kitchen and felt the specific kind of worry that has no object, the kind that lives in the change of rhythm rather than the content of what's said. By May, the calls had stopped entirely. I called him. Sometimes he picked up. The conversations were short and warm, but structurally different from every conversation we'd had for 9 years. He was present, but not available. Engaged with me, but reserved in a way I associated with people who are falling in love, which I asked him about, and he laughed. A real laugh, and said, no, nothing like that. I drove to Grand Rapids in June. Nathan's apartment was a 1-bedroom in a complex near Wealthy Street. I had been there dozens of times. It was always the same. Clean, sparse. He's a little underfurnished in the way of men who buy what they need and do not consider what a room looks like. Couch, television, desk with his personal laptop and a second monitor, a bookshelf that was mostly empty, a kitchen that smelled like coffee and dish soap. When he let me in, the apartment was the same, and Nathan was the same, and something was completely different, and I could not identify it for the first 20 minutes I was there. Then I realized it was the second monitor. It was on. It was always off when I visited. He used it for work overflow and didn't leave it running. Now it displayed what looked like a spreadsheet, but denser than any spreadsheet I'd seen. Rows and rows of data in small type, color-coded with headers I couldn't read from across the room. Nathan saw me looking at it and turned it off, casually. It took the way you close a journal when someone walks into the room, not hiding it, just indicating that it was private. I did not ask about it then. I took him to dinner. We ate at a place he liked on Cherry Street. He was thinner than the last time I'd seen him, not alarmingly, but enough that his collar sat differently on his neck. He ate well. He was funny. He told me about a problem at work involving a corrupted database migration that had consumed a week. He was in every observable way fine. But 3 times during dinner, he took out his phone and looked at it with an expression I had never seen on his face. It was not the expression of someone checking messages or reading news. It was the expression of someone receiving confirmation, a small private satisfaction. Like a scientist checking a result that matched a prediction. Akikai asked him what he kept looking at. He put the phone down and said, "Owen, someone wrote to me about the project. They found a connection to their family. It's really something, Mom." I said, "What project, Nathan?" And he told me about Élan. That's not the real name. I'm using it because Nathan asked me not to publish the real name. And even though the situation has moved past the point where that request makes practical sense, I'm honoring it because he's my son and he asked. Élan was a company town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It was built in 1912 by a copper mining company, one of the large ones, the ones that built entire communities around their operations. Houses, a school, a company store, a small hospital, a church. At peak population in the early 1930s, approximately 1,200 people lived there. It had a post office. It had a baseball team. It appeared on county maps and in census records through the 1940 enumeration. The mine closed in 1951, and here is where the history becomes unusual. The mining company did not simply leave. They owned the land, all of it. They owned the buildings, which had been constructed as company property and leased to workers. They owned the town's charter, which had been issued as an unincorporated community dependent on the company's land use agreement with the county. When the mine closed, the company exercised a clause in the charter that Nathan later described to me as existential foreclosure. They revoked the land use agreement, reclaimed the property, and over the course of 18 months, demolished every structure in the town. The houses, the school, the store, the church. When they graded the land, they replanted it. And they petitioned the county to remove the town from its maps and indices on the grounds that the named community no longer existed as a habitable entity. The county complied. By 1955, Élan appeared on no active county map. The post office had been decommissioned in 1952. The 1950 census was the last to include it. The people, the 1,200 who had lived there at peak, the 400 or so who remained at closure, moved to Houghton, to Hancock, to Marquette, to downstate, to out of state. They took what they could carry, they left behind what the company demolished. Within a generation, according to Nathan, the name had largely fallen out of use even among the former residents, where their children knew their parents had lived up in the copper country, but not the specific name of the town. The town did not appear in county histories published after 1960. It did not appear in any digital index Nathan could find. It was not abandoned in the way that ghost towns are abandoned, with structures left standing, with roads still leading to Kaku's recognizable foundations, with a name that persists on maps in italic type. It was unmade, administratively, cartographically, and physically removed. Nathan had found a single reference to it in a digitized log from a historical society in Houghton County, a passing mention in a 1973 newsletter about former mining communities. He described following that thread for 2 months through microfilmed newspapers, county clerk correspondence, on mining company archives at Michigan Technological University, and the scattered personal papers of a county surveyor who had been involved in the post-closure mapping revision. At the end of those 2 months, he had confirmed that Élan had existed, had housed approximately 1,200 people at its peak, and had been deliberately and comprehensively erased. And then he had started building the census. I need to describe what he showed me, because it's the center of everything that followed, and everything I'm afraid of. Nathan had constructed, on his personal server, a database modeled on the structure of the United States federal census. It used the same field categories: name, age, sex, race, relationship to head of household, marital status, occupation, place of birth, literacy, home ownership status. He had populated it with entries for every resident of Élan he could document or reasonably infer from the fragmentary sources he'd gathered. The database, when he showed it to me that evening in June, contained 437 individual entries. He walked me through his methodology. Some entries were directly sourced. He had found partial census returns from 1920 and 1930 in the National Archives, fragmentary but legible. Some were derived from mining company payroll records, which listed employees by name, position, and sometimes household size. Some were reconstructed from marriage certificates, birth records, death certificates, and church registers that had survived in adjacent county archives. But many, and this is the part I need to be careful about, were not sourced from any document he could show me. But Nathan described a process he called structural inference. Given the known population size, the known demographic patterns of Upper Peninsula mining communities in that period, the known household structures from the partial census returns, and the specific economic and ethnic composition of the town's workforce, primarily Finnish and Cornish, with smaller Italian and Croatian populations, he said he could reconstruct probable household compositions for dwellings he could confirm existed but for which no resident record survived. I am not a statistician. I'm not a historian. I am a retired teacher who raised a boy who became a database administrator. But I know what guessing looks like, and I told him so. He said, "It's not guessing. Watch." He pulled up an entry in a household at what he designated as 14 Tamarack Street, a name he had reconstructed from a 1928 mining company site plan. The entry listed a head of household, Väinö Korhonen, age 44, born in Finland, occupation listed as timberman. A wife, Senja, age 39, birthplace also Finland. 4 children, ages ranging from 16 to 6. The oldest son was listed as a surface laborer. The 2 middle children were listed as students. The youngest was listed with a medical notation that Nathan had added as a custom field. Developmental delay, nonverbal per 1932 School Enrollment Exception Report. I asked him where the School Enrollment Exception Report came from. He said he hadn't found it. He said the entry was structural inference. The household composition was consistent with Finnish mining families of that period, and the medical notation was, and he said, what the data shape suggested. I told him that was not how historical research works. He agreed. Then he turned the monitor toward me and opened his email. The email was from a woman in Duluth, Minnesota. Her name was Karen Lepinen. She had found Nathan's project through a web search. He had published a portion of the database on a simple website, with a note inviting descendants of Élan residents to contact him. Her message read, in part, "My grandmother's maiden name was Korhonen. She grew up in a mining town in the UP. She never said the name, just that they left when the mine closed. Her youngest brother was nonverbal his whole life. The family never talked about him. I only know because my grandmother mentioned him once near the end. How did you know about this? Nathan looked at me, and his face had the same expression I'd seen at dinner. The private confirmation. He said, "This happens about twice a week now. I went home the next day. I did not sleep well that night or for many nights after, but I want to be clear about what was bothering me. Because it was not the obvious thing. It was not the question of how Nathan knew about Väinö Korhonen's youngest son. It was not even the broader question of how his structural inferences kept being confirmed by living people with no prior connection to his research. What bothered me was his weight. Nathan is 5'11". When I saw him in June, I estimated he had lost 15 pounds since Christmas. Not dramatically visible under his clothes, but evident in his face and his wrists, and the way he moved. Slightly careful, and the way people move when their body has changed faster than their proprioception has adjusted. He said he'd been busy and hadn't been eating regularly. He said it the way he said everything, steadily, reasonably, without alarm. I began paying closer attention over the summer. I drove up once a month. Each time the database had grown, 437 entries in June, 583 in July. By August, it was 741. The website had expanded. He'd added a section for descendant stories. The emails he received, published with permission, linking living people to the names in his census. There were 41 stories posted by August. People from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Oregon, Florida. None of them had known the name of the town before finding Nathan's site. All of them recognized something, a name, a street, a detail about a family member that no public record could have provided, and each time I visited, Nathan was thinner. In August, I asked him directly if he was sick. He said no. I asked if he'd seen a doctor. He said he hadn't had time. I made an appointment for him at his GP. He kept it to his credit. The results were unremarkable, the doctor told him. Slightly low iron, slightly elevated cortisol. Nothing that explained the weight loss beyond stress and irregular eating. The doctor recommended he take a break from whatever was keeping him up at night. Nathan did not take a break. In September, the database crossed 900 entries. The descendant community, and that's what they had started calling themselves, a community, they had grown to over 70 people in active contact with Nathan. They had created a group, and they were sharing photographs, family Bibles, fragments of letters. Several had visited the site of Élan, the physical location, which is now a tract of second-growth forest owned by a timber company, with no visible trace of habitation. They posted photographs of the trees and the ground and the nothing that was there, and the comments below the photographs were not grief-stricken or angry. They were grateful. Grateful that someone had proved the place had existed. Grateful that their family's origins had been restored to the record. I read those comments on the drive home from my September visit, sitting in a rest area on US 131 with my phone propped on the steering wheel, and I cried. Not because the comments were sad, because they were beautiful and because my son was disappearing. By October, Nathan had lost 31 pounds. I know because I asked, and he told me, and the number was precise because he was tracking it. Not with concern, with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything. He said he'd noticed the weight loss and attributed it to the project's demands. He said he would eat more. He said it the way he said everything, and I knew he was not lying and was not going to eat more. The database was at 1,038 entries. He had reconstructed nearly the entire population of Élan at its 1930 peak. The structural inferences had become more detailed. Entries now included not just household composition, but daily routines, shift schedules, school attendance patterns, social affiliations, medical histories. He had added a field for last known post-closure location that tracked where each resident had gone after the town was demolished. And these entries, too, were being confirmed. A man in Boise wrote to say that Nathan had correctly identified his great-uncle's post-closure address in Hancock, an address the man had found in a box of papers after his father's death, and which appeared nowhere in any public record. I asked Nathan how he was doing this. Not accusatorily, genuinely. I sat across from him in his living room, which was now dominated by the desk and the monitors. He had added a third, and the walls, which were covered in printed maps and census pages and hand-drawn street layouts. And I said, "Nathan, how do you know these things?" He thought about it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I have not been able to stop thinking about. He said, "I think the town is telling me." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I sit down to fill in a household. I have the structure, the street, the lot number, the dwelling type. I have the demographic range. And then I start, and the names come, and the ages come, and the details come. And they're right, Mom. They keep being right. I don't know how to explain it except that the information is there when I reach for it, like it was waiting." I asked him if he heard voices. He said no. I asked if he had visions or dreams about the town. He said no. I asked if he felt like he was being communicated with by an external presence. He said, "It doesn't feel external. It feels like memory, except they're not my memories." I drove home that night and called his doctor the next morning. The doctor could not discuss Nathan's medical information with me. Nathan was 31, not a minor. I explained my concern. The doctor said he would reach out to Nathan. I don't know if he did. In November, two things happened. The first was that the database reached 1,187 entries, within 13 of the estimated peak population. Nathan told me he was close to completion. He said the word completion with a reverence that frightened me. Not the satisfaction of finishing a project, the reverence of approaching something sacred. The second was that I met the descendants. Nathan had organized a gathering, not a reunion, because these people had never met, but something like one. He invited every descendant who had contacted him to come to Grand Rapids for a weekend. He rented a conference room at a hotel. He printed the full census and mounted it on the walls. He created a map of Élan at 1 to 200 scale and laid it across 4 folding tables pushed together. 38 people came. I was there because Nathan asked me to be. I sat in the back of the room and I watched. I watched middle-aged people from 7 states stand in front of a wall-mounted census page and find their family's name in a town they had never heard of until my son built it back from nothing. I watched a woman from Ashland, Wisconsin trace her finger along Tamarack Street on the map and stop at a lot number and say, "This is where my grandmother lived," and begin to weep with a grief that was 60 years old and had never, until that moment, had an address. I watched a retired teacher from Marquette sit in a corner and read through household entries with his lips moving, and when I approached him, he looked up at me and said, "My father never told us where he was from. He said it didn't exist. We thought he was being metaphorical." I watched my son stand at the front of the room and present his work to these people, and I watched their faces. And their faces held an emotion I can only describe as resurrection. The experience of having something you didn't know was dead returned to you alive. And I watched Nathan, who was wearing a belt I recognized from 5 years ago, cinched 3 notches past where it used to sit, whose wrists were bony and whose skin had a translucency that I have seen before and do not want to name, and who was more alive in that room than I had seen him in years, maybe ever. After the presentation, a woman approached me. She was in her 60s, silver-haired, composed. She said, "You're Nathan's mother." I said I was. She said, I want you to know that what your son has done is the most important thing anyone has ever done for my family. My grandmother died believing she came from nowhere. Your son proved she came from somewhere." I thanked her. I went to the restroom. I locked the stall and pressed my forehead against the door and breathed until I could walk back out, without showing what I was feeling, which was a terror so total and so specific that I still do not have adequate language for it. It was the terror of understanding that my son was doing something genuinely good, something that was healing real people, restoring real histories, repairing a real injustice, and that it was killing him, and that these two facts were not separate. The goodness and the dying were the same act, and the town was coming back, and it was coming back through him, and the passage was not free. December. The database reached 1,193. Nathan said there were 7 households left. He was working on them slowly, he said, because he wanted to get them right. He was by this point visibly ill, not in a way that suggested a specific disease, in the way that suggests depletion, immat, as though he were being consumed from within by a process that was not pathological but metabolic, as though he were being converted. I brought food every time I visited. He ate it. It did not seem to matter. I tried to talk to him about stopping. I tried once in December and once in January. Both times he listened to me with complete attention and complete patience and said, "I can't, Mom. They're almost all back. They're almost all back." Not "it's almost done." Not "the database is almost complete." They're almost all back. As though the people in the census were not entries but presences, and his work was not documentation but retrieval, and stopping before the last name was entered would be leaving someone stranded between erasure and existence. I began to research what had happened to the actual residents of Élan, not through Nathan's database, but through my own clumsy searching, because I needed to understand what he was bringing back and whether it could be separated from him. What I found was not supernatural. It was worse in some ways. The people of Élan had not died mysteriously or suffered some collective fate. They had simply dispersed. They had moved to other towns, taken other jobs, married, had children, grown old, died, and their lives after Élan were ordinary. But the town itself, the fact of it, the name, the 1,200 people who had constituted a community, had been swallowed, not by time, by a deliberate act of corporate erasure. The mining company had decided that Élan would not exist, and the systems that maintain existence, maps, records, indices, names, had complied. The people survived. The place did not. And because the place did not, the people's connection to it, their origin, their shared identity, their proof that they had once belonged somewhere together, was severed. Nathan was repairing that severance, and the repair was costing him everything. In February, I made a decision. I drove to Grand Rapids on a Wednesday, not my usual visit day, with the intention of taking his computer. I am not proud of this. I am not sure it was wrong. And I had watched my son lose 40 pounds in 11 months. I had watched his skin become the color of paper. I had watched the most steady person I have ever known become so consumed by an act of restoration that he could not eat, could not sleep, could not maintain his own body's basic functions. And I had decided that no amount of historical justice was worth my son's life. that the descendants would survive the loss of the database, that the town had been erased once before and the people had endured it, that Nathan could not be the price of Élan's return. I let myself in with the key he'd given me. The apartment was quiet. The monitors were on. The census was displayed on the center screen. 1,198 entries now, 5 remaining. Nathan was not at the desk. He was in the living room. He was not alone, and there were 14 people in his apartment. They were sitting on the couch, on the floor, on chairs brought from the kitchen. Some I recognized from the November gathering. Some I did not. They were looking at photographs. They were talking quietly. One woman was holding a printed census page and reading names aloud, softly the way you read names at a memorial. A man I did not recognize was sitting beside Nathan on the floor, showing him something on a phone. A photograph of a photograph, old, sepia-toned, showing a row of wooden houses on an unpaved street with a dark tree line behind them and a mined headframe in the distance. Nathan looked up at me. He was thin in a way that made me think of candles. Not the metaphor, the actual physics. The way a candle gets thinner as it gives light. He smiled, and the smile was real. And he said, "Mom, this is everyone." He did not mean everyone who was in the room. I understood that immediately and completely. He meant everyone. The room was full of people who had come to sit with the person who had given them back their dead. And Nathan was saying that the dead were there too, in the names being read aloud, in the photographs being passed from hand to hand, in the census that glowed on the monitor in the other room with 1,198 entries and 5 empty spaces. I did not take the computer. I sat down on the floor next to my son. A woman handed me a photograph. It showed 2 girls, maybe 10 years old, standing in front of a wooden building with a sign I couldn't read. Their faces were solemn in the way of early photographs, but one of them had her hand on the other's shoulder, and the gesture was so casual, so unconscious, that it broke something in me. They were friends. They were standing in front of a building in a town that a mining company would demolish 20 years later, and they were friends, and no record of their friendship had survived. And now it was in my hands because my son had reached into the space where Élan used to be and found it. I stayed for 3 hours. The descendants talked and showed photographs and read names. Nathan sat among them and answered questions and added details that came to him the way he'd described. Like memory, like reaching for something that was waiting to be picked up. He was radiant and he was disappearing, and I sat beside him and held a photograph of 2 girls I would never know and understood that I was in the presence of something I could not stop and was no longer certain I should. And 5 entries remain. Nathan says he'll finish this week. He says he can feel them. The last 5, the last households, the last names. He says they're close. He says the word close the way you'd say it about a person approaching a door. I don't know what happens when the census is complete. I don't know if Nathan will recover or stabilize or continue to thin until he becomes what the town became. A place on no map, a name in no index, a life converted entirely into the record of other lives. I don't know if the descendants will sustain what he built, or if it will fade without him the way the town faded without its charter. I don't know if what I'm watching is a haunting or a healing, or whether those are different things. I know that my son is bringing back 1,200 people from the dead, and that the dead are not refusing. I know that a company erased a town because it could, because it owned the land and the buildings and the charter and the maps, and the systems that hold reality in place did what they were told. I know that one man with a database sat down and told the systems they were wrong. And I know that I am his mother, and that I came to his apartment to save his life by destroying his work, and that I sat down on the floor instead, because the room was full of people who were alive because of him, and alive in the sense that they now knew where they came from, which is a kind of life I did not understand until I watched it being given. And I could not take that from them, even for him, even to keep him. The 5 remaining entries. He says he can feel them waiting. He says one of them is a child. I call him every day now, not on Sundays. Every day. He picks up. He tells me about the entries. His voice is thin but clear. He sounds like a man who is almost finished. I don't know what that means. And I call him every day, and every day he picks up, and every day there's one fewer empty space in the census. And I listen to my son describe the life of someone who's been dead for 60 years with the tenderness of a person who remembers being their neighbor. And when we hang up, I sit in my kitchen and I look at the phone and I wait for Sunday, when he used to call me, when the call was about nothing, when the weather didn't require a jacket, when my son was steady and whole and did not know the name of a town that no longer exists.